Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST webinar, The Tactile Side of Food, which is organised by IFST's Sensory Science Special Interest Group. My name is Stephanie Mitchell. I'm the chair of the IFST Sensory Science Special Interest Group. This webinar is the second in our SSG 2021 series, focusing on the human sensory instrument. The talk will look at how the tactile sensory system can affect food perception, considering how textures can physically and visually influence how consumers view what they eat. It will also explore how subtle tactile cues can subconsciously guide consumers towards a more or less favourable perception of food items. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to IFST's Webinar Hub. Feel free to make comments and ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. This can also be used in the case of any technical difficulties. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation where we will respond to as many of these questions as possible. And Carol Rayatha, committee member of the Sensory Science Special Interest Group, will be asking these questions. Our speaker today is Cathrine Jansson-Boyd. Dr. Cathrine Jansson-Boyd is a consumer psychologist based at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. She teaches consumer psychology to both undergraduate and postgraduate students. She's published several articles and is the author of the first textbook to be published that is purely about consumer psychology. For more information on Cathrine's biography, please have a look on the IFST website. So with that, I will hand over to you, Cathrine.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen with you all. So I am going to talk to you about the tactile side of food. Now, when we start off, I'm going to give you a bit of a broader view of the sensory systems and how this is involved, because at the end, it will all come together and be explained why we looked at some additional factors. So bear with me, please. So when we talk about the different sensory systems, and this is really important, that we acknowledge that there are more than one sensory system. Of course, we're going to focus on touch here today, but we also have to consider whether or not it's competing with other senses in order to be able to make a good and accurate estimation of if it's actually highly relevant to the area that we are looking at today, or whether it's kind of disappearing when it's competing against another sense. And often the consumer industries tend to focus on vision, as over 80% of our perceptual system is accounted for by vision in consumer settings. Having said that, we know that if you have the right sensory systems in place and you entice consumers to draw on the other sensory systems, you are much more likely to obtain information that can rival and challenge the vision input that most consumers experience. One example that is not linked to vision or in fact the tactile sense is the sound of products. So this is a really interesting one, because we know if we are conscious of how something sounds when we're actually eating it, it can change the way we view the item we are eating. So an example of this, of course, could be potato chips that makes a very crunchy sound, or a biscuit that makes a very crunchy sound. And in particular, those two items, as I mentioned, potato chips and biscuits, if they don't have a crunchy sound to them, people actually often think that the product is stale or possibly out of date, even though the product itself may be absolutely fine and it just have a slightly different design to it. What is interesting is that it's not just the sound itself from the food that affects how we perceive the item. It's also how something is named. So there's a very well-known study within consumer psychology done by two people called Yorkston and Menon, and they were particularly investigating ice cream. And they found that if they named the ice cream Frosh or Frisch, they were perceived very differently. So if it was named Frosh, for an example, people described the ice cream as being smoother generally and slightly creamier than the one called Frisch that was described as being a little bit icy, a little bit more chilled. And therefore you can see that sound, not just the food sound itself, but also other aspects of sound can have a real impact on the way in which we actually perceive food items. So interestingly enough, if we are looking at the different sensory systems, and we try to map them in regard to how our brain responds to them, you're going to end up with a picture of a human that looks something like what you currently see on the screen. So here you can clearly see that one of the areas that accounts for a large chunk of our perceptual input are our hands. And this, of course, is followed by the mouth itself. Now, you might notice that this individual has no genitals of any shape or form, and this is just to make it more palatable for audiences, and that would otherwise be rather enlarged. But let's focus on the specifics of other elements that's more directly related to food. And of course, when we're talking about the mouth, we're not just talking about taste, we are also talking about tactile input, because what you're experiencing in your mouth, clearly taste is a big and significant component, but you are also physically feeling something. So we feel something everywhere on our bodies. So when we are defining touch, we need to be aware of that it's not just coming through our hands. It might be through our feet, through our legs, anywhere where we potentially can directly physically interact with an item. And because we know that hands in particular, followed by the mouth, are so influential when it comes to how consumers perceive different items. You can't, as a consumer researcher, ignore the fact that touch is incredibly significant and powerful. And when we have conducted research more broadly, we have learned that people have a preference for shops, for an example, where they are allowed to touch. Now, the example here with the computers, of course, is an Apple store. They're famous for the fact that you can go in and you can touch absolutely anything within the shop. And people tend to keep coming back because it's a very good stimulating experience, and experience being the operative word, because again, we know that consumers prefer to have an experience rather than just going to buy something which seems like a quite pragmatic thing to do. They want to have something different, which they can talk to their friends about and so forth. Equally, this is applicable to food shopping, especially things like fruit, whereby you specifically want to feel whether the item is fresh, whether it's too soft, whether it's too hard, depending on what it is you're looking for. And there has been some write-ups in the consumer literature suggesting that one of the reasons why all traditional fruit stores aren't as popular as they once were has something to do with the fact that consumers can't touch the items themselves, especially when it looks like they should be touching the items. So if all the fruits and vegetables are out on display, consumers will automatically feel as if they should be touching them. And if they're then told that they can't, that will lead to a certain level of frustration. So depriving consumers of touching something when they have a need to do so actually leads to very negative emotions. So you do need to be careful with this. However, if you are thinking about perhaps fruit and vegetables being packaged in the supermarket, as you can see the packaging, you know it's covered up, you don't have the same expectations, and you wouldn't expect to be able to feel through the wrapping or whatever it might be, what something feels like. And therefore that limits the levels of frustrations. So you have to be very aware of how and when consumers have a need to touch something and what cues are making them feel like they should be touching something. And interestingly enough, there's a big variation between different people and whether or not they want to touch something. So we can measure people's need for touch on a spectrum. So there are those that are quite low on the spectrum, and who usually just touch things when it's essential. So they have to, maybe this is for comparative reasons, they might use both hands to touch two different things simultaneously, just to see whether or not one is heavier than the other. And then there's those that's very high on the level of need of touch. And they tend to want to touch for the sake of touching. For them, it's an experience. It makes them feel good. And if you followed somewhere around the supermarket, for an example, I'm not suggesting you stalk the customers there, but just hypothetically, you would see that some people literally walk around and they touch almost everything as they go along. And interestingly enough, if you asked people about this, they would not be able to tell you that they had touched anything. In fact, they are more likely to say that they didn't touch something. And this is because touch tends to influence us subconsciously. So you can't really just go out and ask people about it because they won't be able to give you an accurate answer. And we even know that the temperatures that we experience from tactile input can have an influence on whether we perceive something as positive or negative. And this was found in a study by Williams and Barr. This is a few years ago now, but they did a very clever experiment. They invited participants into to come and take part in a study. And they said on the way to the room, there was a Confederate to show them the way. She let them hold a cup of coffee, which was either hot or cold, or as a pretense of saying that she needed to tie her shoelaces or something. So very briefly, they held a cup for her. And when they came to the room in which they were meant to conduct the experiment, they were no longer holding the cup. They did the experiment. And then later on, they were asked what they thought about the experimenter. And they found that those who had held briefly on the way to this study, the cold cup, described the experimenter as being not a very pleasant person, a little bit reserved, whilst those who had touched briefly a hot cup actually described them as warm and friendly and helpful. So this even shows that when we're experiencing something through our hands, we transfer the emotions that we experience on the back of those of that input onto something else. And of course, emotions for consumers are incredibly easy to be misplaced onto something else, and we're often not aware that this actually happens. But one of the reasons that touch is triggering such strong emotions is because it's the same part of our brain that's processing decision-making and emotions that actually process the information that's coming through our skin. So the skin receptors are then mixed with our emotions, which means that the two are very, very closely linked indeed. So when we look at the tactile input, we need to be familiar with how it works in order to be able to figure out how we can best steer people's input in a beneficiary way. And they are basically, tactile interest is basically guided by neural paths. So we have all these little systems that are piggybacking on the back of our nervous system within the body that sends signals to our brains all the time saying that something is touching our skin. So that's quite a nice, straightforward system. But what happens is that the further away the neural paths are from the brain, the signals are being registered. So if you don't mind taking part in this little experiment here, you don't need to say anything for now, but just use your index finger, put it on your lip, and think about where do you feel the sensation. Then you take the same index finger and you put it on your ankle and think about where you're feeling the sensation. So this is where we can measure the length of the neural paths and how they differently are affected in terms of how our brain registers this. Because if you put this index finger on your lip, you should feel the sensation on the lip, as this is shorter distance between your lip and the brain. So your brain quickly picks up on something that goes through your lips. And if you think about this in terms of food, that means that even though you might hold something in your hands, and I'll give you an example of this in a second, your lips are going to be the primary response to how you think about something, because your brain is focusing more on this than it would if it came from your hands. Now, when you're using the index finger and you're putting it on your ankle, hopefully you will feel that you kind of get more of a sensory input through your finger than you do through your ankle. Again, it's because there's a shorter distance from your fingertip to your brain than it is from your ankle to your brain. And this can be used in food settings, for an example, which ergonomists are very good at capitalizing on information such as this. So what tends to happen is that we might go to a fast food restaurant, such as McDonald's, as the picture is showing here, and you are sitting down and you are enjoying a meal. So your first sensory signals that's coming are coming through your mouth, because this is yummy food, you love it, and you are just focusing on how great it's tasting. However, the secondary information is going to come through your hands. And this is why it's important that your hands are having a nice experience, because otherwise you're still going to get negative information reaching your brain and people won't think positively about their fast food experience. So in McDonald's case, this would mean maybe putting the burger in a box. You have to pick up the nice fluffy bun and hold it in your hands. So you're getting positive kind of signals in terms of the bread through your fingers. Or as in the picture, they have a nice sort of crinkly paper that's been quite well used for McDonald's because it's been tested, and people know that people actually think positively of the texture of that wrapping paper. However, of course, McDonald's also don't want you to sit too long in their fast food restaurants, because if you do, you're occupying a seat that could be taken by another customer. And of course, we want a high turnover of bumps on seats, because that's how they're making their money. And therefore, they are creating a not so comfortable chair. So the third set of signals that's reaching your brain that are virtually subconscious are telling you, this isn't so comfy. You're enjoying the food, but you should probably leave soon. And therefore you will leave, and you can kind of use this as a system to send different types of communication to a consumer within fast food restaurants. Now, this whole kind of different types of sensory signals has been utilized a lot in different types of restaurants. There's been quite a big trend in restaurants around the world. The example on the picture here is a restaurant in Spain, whereby they created specific music to go with specific food. They had big dramatic backdrops, they had very specific lighting to kind of create this multi-sensory experience for consumers. But all of it was very cleverly constructed in that they were really thinking about the kind of associations that people have with different types of food. Because a lot of restaurateurs have figured out that we have so many clear associations between foods and different items that you, by just using the right types of associations, can generate a more positive dining experience and also be happy to actually pay for it. However, we need to think about these kind of associations and what is happening and how we can utilize them if we are working from a consumer point of view. And of course, no doubt about it, but food, as we mentioned at the very beginning, is definitely affected by taste and by the olfactory system, so how it smells. And usually those two go very tightly together. And we know that if we keep preparing these two continuously, whatever it is that you're eating and you're smelling it at the same time, then that is what's creating a like or a dislike in regards to a food item. So of course, by doing this over a period of time, we kind of learn that some types of smell and taste go together, and it makes it congruous. We have the expectation that if it looks like this, if it tastes like this, it should actually smell like this. And if the two aren't congruous, it often leads to a negative perception. This is why in the past, when they try to use blue bananas in the supermarkets, consumers are a bit confused about this. They might laugh about it, they might talk about it, but they're not as likely to purchase these sort of things because it is incongruous, and because it's incongruous, they're not comfortable with it. They assume that it has to taste less good than perhaps a yellow banana. So on the basis of this, it kind of stands to reason that this should also be applicable to touch when it comes to food. So we learn what food should feel like, both through the use of our hands and our mouth. And this, of course, makes sense, especially if we're thinking about how we're eating at the early stages of childhood. You know, we often kind of getting in there with our hands to really get a feel for what something feels like. So we're learning from a very early age what something should feel like, and the congruency starts to be created. However, if we look more broadly, because of course new products are developed as we go along, we can see that there is consistency in how consumers are learning whether or not something is incongruent. So one example, admittedly, you can't eat the mobile phone, but it's quite a clear example, is how the mobile phones have developed over time. So what we find is that they make such small changes. They might change in size, but the actual texture of it remains the same. So even though the physical appearance is changing, the tactile expectation of them remains the same, and consumer expects it to feel a certain way. Of course, this kind of happens in terms of food, in the sense that over time, we know that if we're eating a fresh bread roll or something, we don't want it to taste stale. We want it to taste fresh and fluffy, for an example, in order to actually enjoy it. And it's very clear from different studies that we are learning tactile behavior in terms of what's right and wrong. But this can actually be altered depending on the experience itself. So I'm quickly going to show you a clip of someone, the Professor Mosley, who's based in Adelaide in Australia, who's talking about how our brain responds to tactile input depending on experience.
I want to tell you a story that will explain to you the first 3 years of the neurobiology of pain that you would study at university. 8 years ago, I was walking in the bush. I had a sarong on. Very cool. This is what happened. Did you see that? Hang on. This is what happened. Biologically, I'm going to tell you what happened just then. Something touched the outside of my left leg in the skin. That activates receptors on the end of big, fat, myelinated, fast-conducting nerve fibres. And they stream straight up my leg, straight into my spinal cord, up to this part of my brain. And they say, you've just been touched on the outside of your left leg in the skin. Meanwhile, whatever it was is sufficiently intense to activate free nerve endings. We call them nociceptors. They're thin, unmyelinated, slow-conducting Lada neva. Someone knows what a Lada neva is. Nerve fibres. And that message travels up to my spinal cord, and it gets to my spinal cord, and that's as far as it goes. And it says to a fresh neuron in my spinal cord, you've just been, something dangerous has happened on the outside of your left leg in the skin, mate. And the spinal nociceptor takes that message up to the thalamus, which sits in there somewhere, and says, there's danger on the outside of your left leg in the skin, mate. Now the brain has to evaluate how dangerous this really is. So it looks at everything. And the way that I make sense of this, of what happened to me, is the brain thought, frontal lobe, have we been anywhere like this before? Hang on, I'll just ask the posterior parietal cortex. Have we been in this environment before? Yes, we have. Has it happened at this stage of the gait cycle? Yes, it has. Is it coming from the same location? Yes, it is. What is it? Well, your whole life growing up, you used to scratch your legs on twigs. This is not dangerous. I'm going to give you, the organism, just something so you can kick off the twig and continue on your merry way. And that's what happened for me. I can't show you now, but I took off my sarong, got in the river, got out of the river, and that's the last thing I remember, having been bitten by an eastern brown snake. Survivor. Thank you very much. Now, for some reason, the eastern brown snake works by poisoning you, clearly, and one of the things that it does is activates nerve fibres. So actually, my brain would have got all these messages saying, danger, 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 danger. And in its wisdom, it said, no, 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 no. 6 months later, I'm walking in the bush with a boring talker. You know what a boring talker is? Those people, it doesn't matter what they say, it's boring. That's irrelevant, but we'll call her Naomi, because that is her name. Anyway, this is what happened, right? Oh, whoa! And I am in agony. I have got a white-hot poke of pain screaming up my leg. I'll tell you biologically what's happened. Something touched the outside of my left leg in the skin. That activates big, fat, myelinated nerve fibres, which send a message up to here. Just been touched on the outside of your left leg in the skin. It's sufficiently intense to activate these free nerve endings, danger receptors. Take the message to my spinal cord. Just been, something dangerous has happened on the outside of your left leg in the skin. Yes. Well done, you weren't planted. That goes to the thalamus and says the same thing. Something dangerous has just happened on the outside of your left leg in the skin. Nice. So the brain says, thanks very much, thalamus. Kids all right? Good. Anyway, frontal cortex, anything to tell me about this? Hang on, I'll ask the posterior parietal cortex. Where are we? We're walking in the bush. Oh. You're a bit mate happy. This stage of the gait cycle, where's it coming from? Have we been here before? Oh, yes, we have. Last time we were here, you almost died. I'm going to make this hurt so much that you can do nothing else. And I was in absolute agony for what seemed like minutes, screaming pain, until one of my mates looked at my leg and there's a little scratch from a twig. The pain in those situations was totally different because of meaning. I want to try and convince you that pain is
Okay, so this is an extreme example, admittedly, but it's also applicable to food. Let's say you're eating something that you expect to taste a certain way. All of a sudden, it tastes wrong. This gives you very strong associations that will actually live on. And the next time you eat it, you'll be hesitant to eat it because you remember how badly it tasted. Now, equally, this is applicable to touch in food, in the sense that if you actually touch something and it feels a certain way, your brain is registering what it should feel like. And the next time, if it doesn't feel the same way, it will be incongruous and you will perceive the item as less desirable. Now, on this premise, we actually wanted to look at the possibility, bearing in mind that we're learning textures, whether certain textures could actually influence whether or not we find them attractive. I worked on this project with a company called Unilever, and we were specifically investigating this in regard to tea boxes. And interestingly enough, we found that there seemed to be an optimal medium type of texture that actually makes people perceive the boxes in a more favorable way. So then we were thinking, as we were going along, that specifically for food, we will have strong association, and these should clearly be kind of connected to the texture that we see, because we will have the experience that the texture we see will be associated with how food actually feels, whether it's in the mouth as a tactile element, or whether it's on your hands when you are holding it. And of course, this is particularly important in scenarios where you want to communicate perhaps tactile cues. This could maybe be to do with advertising or just general food presentation of some sort. And we therefore wanted to investigate whether or not specific biscuits could perhaps be presented as using different textures, whether they would be perceived as more or less healthy, thinking the whole kind of obesity epidemic that the world is experiencing according to the World Health Organization. We should want to encourage people to eat more healthily. Now, I'm going to show you a film clip of the study that we did, of the study, but that happened to be shown on a news program, just because I thought it could be a bit of fun. But these are examples of the biscuits that we used for the study. So just bear with me and I shall show you the presentation of.
Now, does the shape of our food affect how much we enjoy it? Well, the answer is yes, according to a psychologist from Anglia Ruskin University. And when we told our science correspondent, Richard Westcott, that this experiment used biscuits, oh, he was there in a shot. He's in the Lucky's kitchen for us tonight, Richard.
Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? To have a look at these 6 biscuits, OK, so which ones do you think look the tastiest? Which ones do you think look the healthiest? This is what the experiment that Cathrine did. Cathrine, can you explain? So you got people in and they looked at the 6 biscuits. What were you asking them to do?
Well, we were asking them to look at all of the biscuits, and then we asked them to rate them on how healthy they were, whether they were more or less likely to purchase them, and whether they think they were tasty.
So they couldn't touch them, they couldn't eat them, they were just looking.
Yes. So we were basically using touch cues on a visual basis, just to see whether, if they would feel different potentially, would they also look different, so that people would respond through vision.
OK, so here are the biscuits you made. You've actually brought one. We'll just show they were real biscuits, but that's the only one left, and it's a bit stale as well, so we're not going to eat that one. The others got eaten. So which ones did people pick then? What did they think?
OK, so what happened was that we compared obvious textures versus those that's not so obviously different. And people actually think that when they are obviously being persuaded by different types of textures, they're not saying that they would taste any different, they don't think they look any more or less healthy. But once...
Okay, so these top ones, they thought roughly the same.
Yes.
And bearing in mind, they're all made of the same thing, so
yes.
They don't taste different at all.
And they're the same size. No, so they did, and they smelt the same way as well.
Okay, so the bottom row...
The bottom row, however, people said they look the same, but they're not actually the same in terms of the textures on top of them. But this one is the one they said looked the tastiest. It's also the one they deemed to be the least healthy. And once they thought the texture looked very healthy, they didn't want to buy it, and they thought it was less tasty.
Interesting. So, okay, what's the long-term sort of thing you would use this for? Basically changing the way food looks so that people buy healthier food. Is that the key?
Yes, exactly. That's what you could do. So by having something that potentially looks like it's not healthy, then people will think it's tastier and therefore more likely to buy it, which means you could change people's eating habits without actually having to sell them something that they perceive to taste less good. Because we do know that there is a clear relationship between the way we think something tastes and how we actually think it tastes.
It's fascinating psychology, isn't it? Thank you very much, Cathrine. Now, Janine, I think it would come a bit of a treat for you, okay? Do you want to pick what one you want?
Well, I guess I better go with the oaty one, hadn't I? Are you coming up?
Yeah, the oaty one, okay. Look, yeah, are you ready, okay? Because this has got to go up a flight of stairs, okay?
Oh,
3,
joking.
2, 1.
Ah! Oh! Lovely! Thank you. So you haven't got a cup of tea to go. Actually, if it's coming up the same way, forget about it. Thank you very much. I'll have that a bit later. Now,
so what actually happened here is that we showed participants 6 types of biscuits. They either had very roughly structured textures, medium structured textures, or they didn't have textures at all. And these were then presented either in a way where it was very obvious so that people could see there were clearly different textures, or they were presented in a subconscious fashion. And we actually found that when we presented the textures in a subconscious fashion, something that was medium textured had a better response and people perceived it much more positively. They said it was a yummier biscuit. It was probably slightly more expensive, and they were more likely to purchase it. But here's the crux. They also rated the same biscuit as being less healthy. So what we were suggesting with the study that we conducted is that if you actually want people to make a healthy choice, you need to create a biscuit that's perceived to be sweeter as they think it's tastier. And when it comes to something like a biscuit, consumers usually pick them on the basis of taste rather than actual healthiness. So we also need to have a quick think about, we talked quite a lot about tactile input now and visual cues for tactile input, whether or not we should just purely solidly focus on the tactile input. Well, if you are a food researcher or product designer or whatever it might be, I would recommend, if you are trying to communicate effectively with any kind of individual, you should effectively try to use as many sensory inputs as possible. Because what happens within our brain is that when we're processing information that's just coming from the visual input, it's competing for our attention in the brain. And therefore, we won't process the information in as much depth as possible. But if we're using different types of sensory information that is sending the same kind of congruous information, and it needs to be congruous to ensure that it's positively perceived, then potentially we're going to remember it better and we will respond better to the items. So this is meant to be a little bit of fun, but in terms of congruency, try to think of how you can make people feel like they really, really have a chocolatey experience, for an example, using the different sensory inputs. So that's me done. Hopefully you have found this interesting and it's giving you a bit of an insight into the different sensory systems. So if we have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them.
Thanks, Cathrine, for such an interesting and engaging presentation. It's really, really interesting. So as you said, we're going to move on to today's Q&A session. And just a reminder to all the people attending the webinar, you can submit a question using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you don't know how to use that, you just move your mouse or your finger onto that function and then type in the question. So Cathrine, I'm going to start with first question. From your experience, do you think touch is as influential as in altering food perception as some of the other senses, say vision or taste?
So I genuinely believe that it is. I actually think it might be more influential in all fairness. And this is because it's so closely coupled with emotions. So when we're experiencing anything through our mouth, our hands, feet, arms, wherever it might be, we are experiencing a simultaneous emotion. So you could actually potentially see something without experiencing an emotion, but with touch that's not possible because they both come together in what is called the orbitofrontal cortex in the brain, and therefore it's such a powerful tool if you want to communicate with consumers.
Okay, thanks, Cathrine. Here's a question about the study that you just showed us. Somebody asking, just could you explain the study a bit more, particularly how the consumers perceived some biscuits to be healthier than others, and also sort of the practical applications of that piece of research?
Okay, so in the study that we did, like I said, we had two types of biscuits. They were either very obviously textured, or it was designed in a way that you weren't consciously aware of that the textures were different. And then we asked the participants to rate basically these biscuits, all 6 of them. And they were asked things like, do you think this contains a lot of sugar? Would it be tasty? Do you think it's a healthy product, and so forth? And do you think the biscuit's crunchy? So there was all sorts of attributes that they had to rate them. But really what we were interested in was, can you use specific textures to create something that's perceived to be healthy? So we weren't actually hoping that people would think a healthy looking biscuit would be negative. We were thinking people want to eat healthily, and therefore that should have a positive kind of generate a positive perception. But that didn't actually work out at all. So instead we found that people were saying,
We've lost Cathrine.
Especially the subconscious.
You're back.
Am I back now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Good, and they didn't want to buy them. But when they perceived them as looking high in sugars and being a tasty treat, and they were more likely to buy them, they basically said that's the choice for us. So we're saying that you can use different textures on biscuits to kind of give people an idea that this is going to taste good. So you create it to look like a high sugared biscuit, which is what people want or consider to be the tastiest option. But actually, they could still be a healthy treat, but you just make them look as they would taste sweeter than they are. And then people's perception will actually align with that, and they will think more highly of the product, even though it's still a healthier product.
I see. And do you think over time, as people's experience with products that might be designed differently to to make them healthier, they'll adapt then and change?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, because of course we know that consumers tend to be very stubborn. Hopefully it might be because we again know that we train our preferences. So if our brain believes that something tastes good, even though it might not have been our preferred choice to start off with, eventually our brain, based on experience and what we talked about before, should change and start thinking that that's our preferred option. So if you then eat something that's very, very sweet, you should think, hang on a minute, this doesn't taste quite the way I would like it to make it a tasty treat. So yes, over time, but probably not immediately, because you would need to have a repeated exposure to kind of use that as a learning curve effectively.
Yeah, okay. There's some really good questions coming in, so I'll try and touch on all of them. So one question is about supermarkets and how they can use sensory perceptions to make people think more about food waste. I guess texture would be the focus given this webinar, but if you have any ideas in general as well.
Well, so food waste is a really interesting topic, of course, as we know that consumers tend to be particularly good at wasting fresh produce. We don't have a solution as yet, but it might be that if we're making things look in a certain way, so we might not just talk about textures here, but we might talk more about general aesthetics and pleasing aspects of it, that people will feel that they've invested in it somehow more emotionally, and therefore they will be less likely to throw it out. Of course, that's hard to guarantee. My current project, which is actually funded by RAP, funnily enough, is looking at food waste. And we know it's very, very complicated, because it's not just down to, do I want to waste food or not? There's so many other components that comes into it. And especially if you're not living on your own, you are talking children, partners, maybe even a cat and a dog. There are so many things that has a role to play in whether or not something will be consumed. So it is incredibly complicated. So if I can get back to you on that question in a year when our project's finished, that would be awesome. But as it stands, there is no immediate solution in regards to how we could do that.
Okay. Here's a question about introducing new foods to both children and consumers in general. I'm supposing, yeah, the question is how do you introduce in general, but really, yeah, I'd be interested in as well, novel textures and things. How do you go about getting people to try them or accept them?
Well, so one very simple way to do it, especially with children, is to make it look like something that they've had before, that they are familiar with, and that we know that they liked. Of course, as we know, a lot of the food smells and congruency elements are things we learn. But the brain also, of course, have certain flavors hardwired that we are born with, like sweet and sour. So you can build on that by making something look like it might be sweet, because children are very quick, even, you know, someone who's 5-6 months who's just started eating are very quick learners in regards to what it looks like if it's sweet. And we like sweet. Our brains are very happy with sweet. So if you can then make new and different food to look a bit like the sweet things you've given them, then that will make it an easier process to introduce it. Of course, the same applies to adults, which is exactly what we were proving in our biscuit experiment. You make it look a certain way based on textures, and people think more positively about it. So I wouldn't say it's tricking people, but I would say it's encouraging them perhaps to make a braver choice when otherwise we just don't want to, because of course consumers are very habitual. We don't like breaking whatever it is we do normally. And if I know I like this, why should I swap it for something else? But by making it look the same, of course, we have a better chance and maybe kind of broadening our horizon in terms of what something could taste like.
Okay. I mean, I have a question from me about personalities, and have you done work, or do you know of work that looks at people's personality types and how much they like novel textures or not?
So I personally haven't looked at personalities, but there is no research that's actually clearly suggesting that it's to do with your kind of, you know, if you're looking at personalities such as extroverts or introverts or whatever it might be, that doesn't seem to actually fit with it. So there was quite a lot of researchers that were suggesting that perhaps on the basis of cultural differences, we would see huge cultural differences in our responses to textures. We can't even find that. So there's even sort of similarities between Italians and the Americans and the Swedes, which indicates it's more about individuals and whether or not they like interaction haptically that is guiding their kind of need to integrate with different touches. Where that comes from is an interesting one, and we don't know that for certain either. But it seems to be guided perhaps from childhood. So again, it's a bit like a learning experience. If you are encouraged to explore things physically all the time as a child, you're more likely to keep it up later in life because you have the kind of scaffolding for it, for saying this is great, this is fun, you're always praised for doing so, and then you just continue through life. So that might be one explanation. Someone else has even gone as far as saying that maybe this comes from mothers, that, you know, they cuddle you more or less. Who knows? I mean, maybe there's even a factor of that in there. I suspect the whole kind of scaffolding that you're learning as you're going along is probably more realistic, but that's just a guess.
Okay. This question is sort of follow on from that. Are you aware if there's an effect of age on perception of texture?
Yes, so there is in terms of actual touch, and whether it's through your mouth or whether it's through your hands. And this is because the sensory receptors in your fingertips as you get older becomes dulled. They are still more reliable, interestingly enough, than something like vision, because of course our visual input really suffers as we get older. But we are not perhaps as finely tuned to different textures if we're touching them as we would be when we're younger. These differences are, however, relatively subtle, but there is still enough to say that if you really want to communicate with an older consumer, you might want to make sure that the texture is a little bit more prominent so that they can really feel it in terms of interaction.
Yeah, okay. This question is about packaging, and I guess the visual texture is relevant. It's about, is there a relationship between purchasing decision and percentage of transparency in the packaging? So does the amount of visibility of the product affect the purchase decision?
So if the packaging is transparent?
Yeah, I guess so. If there's windows and things.
Okay, so that's a really interesting question, and one that I can't provide a clear answer for, because it will depend on how transparent is transparent. Does it mean that the transparent look that you see straight through onto the product? Because if that's the case, then of course the product itself would influence whether or not the consumer responds to it in a certain way. If you can see clearly the packaging, but you can also see the product, people still think of it as packaging, and the packaging itself would therefore influence the consumer perception, and then we're back to the texture of the actual packaging. So it isn't a simple, straightforward answer. And of course, it also depends on what we're talking about, because if it's a product that perhaps you have more of a need to see, then of course that will be the person or the consumer will focus on whatever they can see through that, and it will still be the product that's affecting them. but if we are talking about bananas versus, I don't know, ketchup or something, ketchup, we probably don't particularly have a need to see the bananas. We may have more of a desire to see to make sure they're not bruised and so forth. So it really will depend on exactly what we're talking about. So there's not a simple answer to that, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, there's a question about, if I can understand it, about things where people might like, or they might have a different opinion about the flavor than they do about the texture. And I guess examples of those, the example is peanuts, and that some people like peanuts, but they don't like peanut butter, probably because of the texture. And I guess your thoughts around those kind of foods or food pairs and what's going on there.
Well, again, I don't think it's just to do with the haptics of it, because peanut butter, even though, yes, it of course taste of peanut, is not purely just a taste of peanut. So it's more likely to be a combination of flavors and textures. And it might be that it's not the pure flavor that the consumer is actually expecting. But yes, there are, I guess, instances. I'm trying to think of one directly. It might be that you love bananas in its whole form, but you mush them up, and then all of a sudden you find the stickiness difficult to deal with. Still pure banana, but it's just in a slightly different format. So yes, but that's about how we learn about specific textures. So if you never ate mushy banana when you were little, you never learned that it came in two forms, then you're going to struggle more with the texture of the mushiness than you would if the banana was intact, if that makes sense. So it's very much about your congruency. So what have you learned? How do you think it should feel? And of course, if we're looking globally at food, that's quite interesting, because people use food ingredients in very different ways and come up with very different texture depending on what country we're talking about. And therefore, again, if you're brought up in one country and you then travel to another one, you might think, hang on a minute, this is just weird, because it doesn't fit your perception. So we all have, of course, individual perception based on experiences, and that's something we just can't move away from.
And I guess we're running out of time, but I have one final question. Just from your personal experience, what's the strangest textured food you've ever eaten?
Oh, good question. The strangest, oh my goodness. I have eaten some weird things in my life, I can tell you, but I think it's gonna have to be probably raw minced meat the first time I tried it as a child. Now I'm a vegetarian, maybe that's why. Because again, I had a real love as a child for meatballs, but also where I was brought up, they do a version of this, but it's raw with an egg on top. And I think the fact that I wasn't introduced to it little by little, it was just like a shock one day. There it was on the plate and I tried it and I hated the texture. And after that, I could never really eat minced meat again. So I think that was the weirdest for me. Not a very exciting one, perhaps, but yeah, definitely had a long-lasting impact.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Cathrine. It's really great answers to some really interesting questions from the audience. I'm sorry if I didn't get to everyone's question. But if I didn't manage to answer your questions, you'll be able to contact Cathrine directly. Her details are on the screen now. So I just wanted to thank everyone who's come from all different parts of the globe, I think, to attend the webinar today. And of course, Cathrine so much, and Stephanie and the IFST team. And we'll share a recording of the webinar, including the Q&A session, to everyone who attended today. You'll get notice via email, and it'll be on our webinar hub. And just finally to say thank you again to Cathrine and everyone who attended and all your wonderful questions.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for everyone that attended.